Today, again, I'm going to start this program with a discussion of the situation, the military situation in Ukraine. I've noticed that at least in the British media, coverage of the military situation in Ukraine has effectively stopped. I haven't seen detailed updates for some time. Perhaps a further indicator of how bad the situation has become. But anyway, the news becomes more dramatic every day, and it's starting to look as if we're moving from a situation for Ukraine. We're moving from a situation which for Ukraine goes from disaster to outright catastrophe. First thing to say is that we have had reports early this morning that a group of Ukrainian troops is now cut off in the western part of Berdychi. And that information came from Kimakovsky, Igor Kimakovsky, who is one of the numerous advisors of Denis Pushilin, who is the head of the Donetsk regional government. Donetsk, of course, now being a part of Russia. Now, Avdiivka, of course, is within Donetsk region, and that is why the regional government of Donetsk is particularly well informed about what is going on. It's also worth adding that a significant number of the troops who are undertaking the fighting in the Avdiivka area, where these events, many of these events that we've been discussing are playing out. A significant number of the troops there were originally troops of the Donetsk militia, which have now been reorganized and apparently comprehensively retrained and formally incorporated into the Russian armed forces. So the fact that these are former militia troops, often with officers who served in the militia, that is another way in which the Donetsk regional government stays particularly well informed about what is going on the battlefield. Anyway, this is what Kimakovsky is reported to be saying this morning, is reported to have said earlier this morning as published by the official Russian news TASS news agency. Ukrainian troops have been trapped on the outskirts of the village of Berdychi near Avdiivka. Igor Kimakovsky, an advisor to the head of the Donetsk People's Republic, has told TASS. The Ukrainian army is experiencing problems with logistics and ammunition supply. And then we have a direct quote from Kimakovsky. The Ukrainian forces in Berdychi are actually encircled. In the current situation around the village, the enemy no longer feels at ease. It experiences problems with logistics and the supply of ammunition and essentials. And then Kimakovsky added that a small group of Ukrainian troops was trying to hold the defense on the outskirts of the village. Now that seems as if this is a group of Ukrainian troops, a rear guard, the 47th Mechanized Brigade, which was previously defending Berdychi, has been withdrawn, but apparently a battalion of the Ukrainian army, to be precise, a battalion of the 115th Brigade has apparently been trapped in Berdychi, where it was forming a rear guard covering the withdrawal of the elite 47th Mechanized Brigade. Now, within a few minutes of my starting this program, I read this report on Slavyangrad and it says this: an encircled battalion of the 115th Brigade and the 104th Territorial Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces at the junction of Semenyovka and Berdychi is ready to surrender. Negotiations with the commander by cell phone were successful for the latter. Now, that's Slavyangrad. I've discussed Slavyangrad in many programs. It's a Telegram channel. It's pro-Russian, strongly pro-Russian. It also functions as a site aggregator. It publishes reports that come from other Telegram channels, but it also publishes reports which it appears to be getting directly from people on the front lines or who are in contact with people on the front lines. And it is generally reliable, and it also provides a great deal of analysis. I say generally reliable. Actually, I would correct that. I would say that it is very reliable, which is not to say that sometimes it doesn't get information wrong. Anyway, here we have a report that a battalion, or perhaps more correctly, a group of battalion strength of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, so we're talking about probably several hundred men, is now encircled at the junction of Semenyovka and Berdychi and is negotiating the terms of its surrender, and its commanding officer has apparently agreed that it should surrender. Now, that would be a major event in what, as I said, has been an escalating catastrophe for the Ukrainians. If it happens, and at the moment we're only getting reports, we've had this report from Kimakovsky, which, by the way, I would say is probably very reliable, that a Ukrainian unit has been encircled. But anyway, this is from Kimakovsky, very reliable. The report from Slavyangrad that the unit is now negotiating its surrender, I would put it just a level of lower reliability, actually, but quite plausibly it's true. But anyway, if a unit of battalion strength of the Ukrainian army surrenders in the field, that will be a major development. Something like that apparently happened about 2 weeks ago in the village of Vodanoye, north of Pervomaisky. This was apparently a battalion of the 25th Airborne Brigade, an event which infuriated the Ukrainian command, General Syrsky, and has led to the apparent decision to disband that brigade. But another battalion, apparently belonging to an entirely different unit, the 115th Brigade, but also apparently including men of the 104th Territorial Brigade, they have decided to surrender, apparently, at least according to Slavyangrad as well. So that would be 2 complete battalions of the Ukrainian army within the last 2 weeks, if this report is true, which it probably is. So, complete units of the Ukrainian military starting to give up. Now, the thing to say is that the battalion, according to Slavyangrad, comes from the 115th Brigade. This is the brigade which collapsed in Ocheretino, that failed to defend Ocheretino. It is apparently a new brigade made up almost entirely of recently mobilized men, which was rushed to the front line. It has come under intense criticism from other Ukrainian units, more experienced units, for its collapse in Ocheretino. It looks as if this brigade was weakly led by poor and inadequate commanders, who apparently, many of them are under arrest or investigation. And it seems to have been made up of deeply demoralized soldiers, some of whom apparently are not keen on fighting. But you can also perhaps see one reason why they would be demoralized, because I've said that this looks like it was left behind in Berdychi Semenyovka as a rearguard for the elite 47th Mechanized Brigade. The men of this battalion, if they are indeed encircled, as I'm sure is the case, and if they are indeed intending to surrender, as is highly likely the case, must be feeling that they're being thrown to the wolves in order that other more privileged units of the Ukrainian army, specifically the 47th Mechanized Brigade, can survive. And it's not surprising if they're feeling angry and demoralized because of that, and if that is motivating them to choose to surrender. Anyway, to repeat a point which I've been making in several programs now, we are seeing growing signs of disaffection and anger within various brigades. We see the 25th Airborne Brigade. It suffered a mass surrender near Pervomaisky and is apparently being disbanded. We see the 67th Assault Brigade, which is an elite brigade made up of men based around the right sector political group, far right, ultra-nationalist. They apparently retreated without orders in the Chasiv Yar area, and that brigade looks like it's going to be disbanded as well, with furious denunciations of the Ukrainian authorities coming as a result from the leader of right sector, the frankly rather dangerous politician, dangerous to his opponents at least, Dmitry Yarosh. We have seen reports that the 3rd Assault Brigade, made up of, which is basically the reconstituted Azov Brigade, has become increasingly a law unto itself, refusing to participate in a counterattack in Avdiivka during the fighting there in February, unhappy about being redeployed in Chasiv Yar, making its own decisions, basically, about where it should fight and how it should fight. And, well, there have been reports of other problems with other brigades as well. And it looks like the 115th Brigade is in effect collapsing on the battlefields, especially if this report of this latest surrender turns out to be true. Now, this thing becomes infectious if entire units of the Ukrainian army start to surrender, if brigades begin to collapse, and we're not yet seeing a situation where whole brigades are giving up the battle, but battalions start to surrender, well, that's a step in that direction. But if we start to see a situation where first battalions and then ultimately brigades start to surrender, well, then it's going to be, just put it mildly, a very critical situation for the Ukrainian authorities indeed, and they would start to become alarmed. One suspects that their entire army is becoming increasingly unreliable. And my last point on this issue is that, of course, coming back to the 115th Brigade, I've made the point that it is largely made up of recently mobilized men. Now, we see how Ukraine has been trying to mobilize forces to replace losses, how unpopular that is in Ukraine. I've just seen a film of a large group of Ukrainian men running across the border into Hungary, trying to escape the dragnet of the mobilization that is taking place in Ukraine. We can see how units that are made up of unwilling soldiers simply do not have that sense of cohesion and reliability that Ukrainian brigades have had in the fighting up to now. So mobilization, pressing on with this mobilization, particularly if it is based on the forced return of hundreds of thousands of men who have actually already left Ukraine and have fled into Europe, well, that might not be such a good idea. Just saying. Anyway, there we go. That is one big piece of news. We haven't yet had the complete explanation of what is happening, but it does look as if the situation, there is some reason to think that near Berdychi, a battalion of the Ukrainian army has been encircled. Igor Kimakovsky is telling us that, and he's probably telling us the truth. And Slavyangrad is telling us that this battalion is now negotiating the terms of its surrender. And, well, that is highly plausible and probably also true. I will just make one final point. I have been saying that with the fall of Ocheretino, with the fall of Novobakhmutivka, with the fall of Solovyova, it made absolutely no sense for the Ukrainian military to continue to defend Berdychi. This was a fundamental mistake, that there was a high probability that any Ukrainian troops who did defend Berdychi would be trapped. And here we have reports, one from Kimakovsky, no less, telling us that that is exactly what happened. Once again, the Ukrainian military has taken the reckless step of refusing to authorize withdrawals of its forces when those could have been successfully carried out, with the result that an entire battalion of the Ukrainian army looks like it's been cut off and may be about to surrender. We've seen this story repeat itself time and again. It started with Mariupol back in the summer of 2022, when the Azov Brigade and another brigade, Ukrainian Marine Brigade, were trapped, ultimately became trapped under the Azovstal factory and were eventually forced to surrender. We've seen that in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, where the Ukrainian troops took the decision, apparently by themselves, to flee across the fields without orders, suffering some losses in the process, but mostly escaping. We see that in Bakhmut, where much the same happened. Ukrainian troops held out for far too long in Bakhmut. Even the American authorities, the Pentagon, concedes this, with the result that losses in Bakhmut were far higher than they needed to be. And now we're seeing it again happen in the Avdiivka sector, first in Avdiivka itself, where, according to some reports, up to 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers were captured when the defense of that town collapsed. And now we're seeing it happen again in the Berdychi-Semenyovka area. There's been endless commentary, especially in the West, about Ukraine's successful offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson region. But the point about those is that the Russians carried out orderly withdrawals of their troops from situations where the defense had become either too difficult or straightforwardly unsustainable. The result was that the forces were preserved and were able to fight and win another day. What Ukraine has been doing through these determined defenses of undefendable positions is that, yes, they have slowed down the Russian army, but at appalling cost. And that cost is now starting to have an effect, with Ukrainian units starting to appear on the battle lines, which, rather like the hapless 115th Brigade, seem to be unfit for purpose. Anyway, that's only one piece of news that's coming from the battle lines. And maybe it's the most dramatic, and if this battalion does surrender in the way that is being said, it will be, a big event. But lots of other things are taking place as well. But before I turn to that, let me just begin by talking about another massive Russian missile strike that took place across Ukraine last night. And this appears to have been carried out again on a major scale. It's not exactly clear how many missiles the Russians launched and how many drones the Russians launched at Ukraine, but most reports speak of about 50 drones, Iranian true drones, and between 30 and 40 missiles. And the missiles were the usual mixture. So there were Kh-101s launched from Russian strategic bombers deep inside Russian airspace. There were Kalibr missiles launched by ships of the Black Sea Fleet. There were Kh-59 and 69 subsonic ground tracking, terrain following short-range cruise missiles, high subsonic cruise missiles, launched, one presumes, from Sukhoi 34 fighter jets, and at least 4 Kinjal hypersonic missiles were also launched. Now, the Ukrainians claim that they shot down perhaps 70% of these missiles. Again, we have all of these claims about missiles shot down. Perhaps that's true. It doesn't seem very likely, if I have to be frank. But anyway, that was what the Ukrainians say. The principal target of the strike, again, seems to have been the Ukrainian energy system. We'll have to wait and see what the Russian Defense Ministry tells us. But one of the targets was the Bushtin thermal power plant near Bushtin thermal power plant, the Krivoy Rog thermal power plant, and perhaps the Pridneprovskaya thermal power plant. 3, at least, power plants apparently attacked. And there's some reports that the Bushtin thermal power plant, which apparently is the biggest of the 3, was completely knocked out and is out of action. But it was not the only, those are not the only targets. Apparently, a pumping station, underground pumping station, an underground gas storage facility was also destroyed, and military installations in the area of the Starokonstantinov airfield were also apparently attacked too. Now, Starokonstantinov is where the Ukrainian Sukhoi 24 fighter bombers are based, which launched the Storm Shadow missiles. Just saying. And it has been the target of Russian missile and air attacks before. Anyway, a major missile strike, apparently significant damage done to the Ukrainian energy system. One big thermal power plant apparently effectively destroyed, damage done to two others, but the most complete discussion, or at least the report about this attack, for that we will have to wait and see what the Russian Defense Ministry itself tells us in the military update, which it is going to publish later today. So altogether, a major Russian missile strike over the last 24 hours. But it's accompanied, all of this event, these attacks on the missiles, these missile strikes, are accompanied by further reports of more major Russian advances along the battlefronts. Now, we have seen that there has been a crisis for the Ukrainians in Ocheretino. All of the reports, Ukrainian and Russian, tell us that it's come entirely under Russian control. The only party that has not confirmed that is the Russian Defense Ministry. I'm going to give my own reason for that shortly. But anyway, Ocheretino fully under Russian control, Novobakhmutovka under Russian control, Solovyova, village west of Novobakhmutovka, it's now been confirmed, and apparently there's pictures of this, Russian troops with flags and all that. Apparently that is now also under Russian control. Semenyovka to the south, under Russian control. Berdychi, subject to the surrender, the final surrender of this battalion, also coming under Russian control. Reports that the Russians have entered the village of Arkhangelskoye to the north of Ocheretino. I've already discussed all of that. But it seems that the Russians have indeed entered this village. There's not yet any film about this, but it seems fighting is taking place in this village. It's not clear to me who the Ukrainian defenders in this particular village are, but anyway, fighting is taking place. And reports early this morning that the Russians have made further big advances in Novokalinovo, village to the east of Ocheretino, and a report that they've entered the village of Keramik, which is immediately to the north of Novokalinova, and a report this morning that they've actually captured the entire village of Keramik. So it looks as if the Russians are pressing in Novokalinova. It seems that most, though not all, of Novokalinova has now been captured. Perhaps the Russians control 50% of this village. This is a pure guess on my part, but suggestions that they control at least some, and perhaps all of Keramik as well, and that they've entered Arkhangelskoye, which is northeast of Ocheretino. Now, as a number of people, Dima at the Military Summary channel being one, but now increasingly more and more others have pointed out, if the Russian forces who are supposedly in control of Keramik, join up with the Russian forces that are apparently storming Arkhangelskoye, then Ukrainian troops in Novokalinovo still defending Novokalinovo, and in the fields around Novokalinovo are likely to become trapped, or rather will become trapped as well. We would be looking at perhaps another battalion, maybe more than that, of Ukrainian troops. Again, just to repeat a point I have made before, if it is indeed the case that Keramik has fallen, if it is indeed the case that Arkhangelskoye is now being stormed, the obvious and correct thing for the Ukrainian command to do is to order an immediate retreat from Novokalinovo, except that that village is also lost, and pull the troops who are defending it out. Leaving them there risks the same thing happening to them as is happening to the troops who have been encircled near Berdychi, and we could have perhaps the encirclement and eventual surrender of yet another Ukrainian battalion, if that is the true number of the troops who are caught up in this fighting. So, another very bad outcome for the Ukrainians on this part of the Ocheretino battlefield, but it's looking grim elsewhere as well. Now, we have not had many reports recently about what is going on in the Netailovo, Yasnobrodovka and Umanske area, though it is likely that fighting is actually taking place in all of these places. Dima at the Military Summary Channel has come up with an elaborate discussion about how, with the Russians having destroyed the bridges that crossed various water barriers in the area, there is a risk that Ukrainian troops in the fields and in this general area, who are still Ukrainian troops who are still located east of some of these places, Umansky, Yasnobrodovka, and the rest, could become trapped. The collapse of the Ukrainian battalion immediately on the outskirts of Berdychi would no doubt presumably close that trap even further. It's important to say again that these water barriers, which many have described as potentially offering Ukraine another line of defense, well, if these reports are true, then it's not a line of defense. It looks like a trap for the presumably hundreds of Ukrainian troops still to the east of it. But anyway, I am skeptical that this water barrier is quite as imposing a barrier as it appears. I would have thought that it would be possible for the Ukrainian troops to move past these water barriers, to pull their machines and some of their men, most of their men and some of their machines across it. Though, as Dima says, it may be that they will have to abandon a lot of their equipment and, of course, their ammunition in the fields. Well, if that is true, then again, the logic is clear, or so it seems to me. I don't know how many Ukrainian troops there really are in these fields, but again, the Ukrainian command ought to give orders to them, if it is, of course, still in contact with them, which perhaps it isn't, but it ought to give them orders to withdraw as well. Anyway, that's one area of the fighting. I should say that with Berdychi with what is apparently happening in Berdychi, the way anyway opens up for the Russians to press forward with any westward advance that they might be planning. Ocheretino, the fall of Ocheretino, has already essentially unraveled, or so it seems to me, the attempt by Ukraine to create a defense line along the line of Netailovo, Umansky, and this, and Yasnobrodovka, because they now control Ocheretino. The Russians can look like they can bypass it. But anyway, again, with Berdychi falling, Ukrainian positions in these three villages, Netailovo, Umansky, and Yasnobrodovka, now look to me, again, undefendable. And logic, once more, suggests to me that the right thing for the Ukrainians to do, once again, is to pull back. Now, that's all very bad, but far worse is what appears to be happening in Krasnogorovka. And again, here we see more evidence of what happens when the Ukrainians decide to defend positions that have become undefendable. The moment Pervomaisky fell to the north, defense of Krasnogorovka became in effect impossible. But the Ukrainians, once again, refused to accept the logic of that. They've defended Krasnogorovka. I get the sense that the supply lines there are now incredibly fragmented and very weak. There are reports now that the Russians have captured the entire industrial zone. Yesterday, I spoke about how they apparently entered one of the factories and raised their flag in part of it. It appears that the entire industrial zone has now fallen. And it looks as if Ukrainian defenses in Krasnogorovka have now been cut in two, that they've been divided by the Russians. And it's all looking like a repetition of Avdiivka all over again. Likely a sudden collapse in Krasnogorovka before long, probably within the next day or so, maybe a bit longer. I mean, I'm not perhaps the best person to guess, but with the loss again of hundreds of men, probably in effect encircled, with another big haul of prisoners falling into Russian hands. So, a terrible situation. And again, this morning, news from an entirely different part of the battlefront, that the Russians have suddenly reactivated the front lines near Kupiansk, that they've broken into the village of Kislovka, to the south of Kupiansk, that they're systematically destroying the bridges on the Oskol River. There's even some claims, though I don't believe them, that the entire village of Kislovka has already been captured by the Russians. If that is true, or if it turns out to be true before very long, then it's likely again that Ukrainian defenses in the south of Kupiansk are going to start to collapse, with the prospect which appeared to arise in the autumn, but which was perhaps temporarily shelved by the Russians, of an advance by the Russians towards the Oskol River, and perhaps an advance then across the Oskol River on pontoon bridges. The Russians are experts in creating pontoon bridges. Anyway, an advance across the Oskol River, encircling perhaps Kupiansk from the south. That is looking very far ahead, and I don't know what it is exactly that the Russians are going to do. Anyway, here we are. We have a situation where the Russians appear to be taking in, capturing large numbers of Ukrainian prisoners, or are in the process of doing so. Ocheretino, Novobakhmutivka, Solovyova, possibly Keramik, almost certainly before long, Novokalinova, probably Arkhangelskoye, Krasnogorovka as well, all falling under Russian control within just a few weeks of fighting. And a report as well that the Russians now look like they're breaking into Kislovka. Perhaps that village has been captured already. I doubt it, but who knows? Perhaps it will be captured fairly soon. And reports that the Russians have also broken into the village of Razdolovka in the Siversk area and are in the process of storming and perhaps capturing that village as well. And if we go north, the Russians have effectively encircled the micro-district east of the canal, close to Chasov Yar. And I read yesterday reports that the 98th Airborne Guards Division of the Russian army has advanced and gained more ground in the Chasov Yar area, though I'm not fully able to say where and in what way. Anyway, this is a string of major defeats for the Ukrainians and significant successes for the Russians. And I'm going to suggest that this is why the Russians, having seen one village after another captured in quick succession, and with large numbers of Ukrainian troops being rounded up, this is the reason why they haven't yet published it all in their military bulletins. They're waiting for the completion of some of these operations, probably the completion of the Battle of Krasnogorovka, and then probably we're going to have another meeting between Shoigu and Putin, perhaps in the Kremlin, with Shoigu reporting to Putin about all of these successes, about the hundreds of Ukrainian prisoners that have been captured, about the large amount of equipment that has been captured, about the defeat of the Abrams tanks, 5 of which have been destroyed, and apparently an engineering vehicle based on based on the Abrams tanks. I suspect it's the same engineering vehicle that we've seen in the past, operate in the past. That's apparently now been captured intact by the Russians, who will thereby, by the way, gain access to the Abrams' rather temperamental gas turbine engine. They'll be able to test it and find out how it works, all of that. But anyway, I suspect that Shoigu, at some point over the course of the next week or so, is going to meet with Putin and is going to present to Putin information about this huge victory that the Russians have achieved in central Donbass. The defeat of multiple Ukrainian brigades, the capture of important fortified villages, the capture of an important fortified town, Avdiivka, and the capture of territory which positions the Russians to make further important advances in key strategic directions. So I think that is coming. We shall probably see it at some point over the next few weeks. And as always happens when Shoigu and Putin meet, a discussion will take place, and as happened with the discussion that took place immediately following the fall of Avdiivka, we will learn an awful lot from this discussion about what is actually taking place on the battlefronts. Anyway, let's wait and see for that to happen. Now, there was a very remarkable article in the Financial Times. I'm not going to read it, but it is another article written in a state of euphoria following the passage of the appropriations bill for Ukraine by Congress. And it spoke about Russia's degrading superiority in weapon systems. It repeated the old exhausted tropes about the poorly trained, poorly led Russian army, that it will not be able to conduct defensive operations with any success. It might be able to gain some territory over the course of the summer, but because of this new appropriation from the United States, overall, the Ukrainians will be able to hold out. Well, as to that, all I would say is whoever has written this article, or perhaps more properly, the editors of the Financial Times, cannot be following closely the events on the battlefronts over the last few weeks. Because what we're seeing is what is shaping out to be a catastrophic defeat for the Ukrainians, and a catastrophic defeat, the full extent of which we're not yet even able to assess. It is, again, testimony that these articles continue to be written even after the catastrophic defeat of Ukraine's summer offensive, even after the fall of Avdiivka, even after the collapse of Ocheretino, and all of the other things that are now happening. It is testimony to the inability of some people to give up on the tropes and memes that have informed them and distorted their understanding of the war for so long. Jacques Beau, in his book, The Russian Art of War, is scathing about all of this. He discusses all of this inability of some people to grasp the realities. He discusses it at great length. Anyway, let's see now what's actually happening with that appropriation. We have seen the first delivery or intended delivery of military aid to Ukraine. I discussed this in a program I did 2 days ago. Apparently it's worth $1 billion. It is rather less impressive than some claims had led us to think. We're now getting reports that the Pentagon is putting together its biggest arms package of all, worth some $6 billion. Except, of course, that it turns out that most of the equipment intended for Ukraine will have to be produced. This applies above all to the Patriot missile interceptors and to much of the other equipment as well. And apparently the Pentagon is openly saying that production of some of this equipment is going to take years. Now, the question is this appropriation coming out of the $13.8 billion in terms of weapons that are allocated for Ukraine within the wider $61 billion appropriation? Or is it coming from the $23 billion part of this package, which is supposedly for restocking American arsenals? Well, following on the breakdown of this package that Dr. Jack Rasmus has done, which I think is the best, I think it must come from the $13.8 billion package. The $23 billion package is intended specifically to rebuild American arsenals. In fact, as Dr. Rasmus has said, I am sure, like him, that it covers the cost of weapons that have already been supplied to Ukraine. That's its true purpose. So, if that is right, then we've had a $1 billion delivery, or intended delivery, which we've been hearing about, the 12 Bradleys and the Sparrow missiles and the Javelins and the Stingers, the HIMARS rockets, which are apparently intended to be rockets. They're not, apparently, it does not cover ATACMS missiles. Anyway, we've had that one, worth $1 billion. And now we've had another appropriation of $6 billion for weapons that are going to be supplied, some of them, the most expensive weapons, in a couple of years' time. That is more than half the $13.8 billion appropriation. $8 billion, $7 billion of it. It doesn't look as if Ukraine is really going to get that many weapons after all. Just saying. Now, that perhaps explains why there is again a major operation underway, apparently by NATO, the EU, and the US to squeeze more money out of the US's, to squeeze more weapons out of the US's European allies. So Greece has been under relentless pressure to transfer to Ukraine its S-300 system and its Patriot missile systems. Apparently the Greek government for the moment is saying no, they need these systems. They don't say against whom, but as I discussed in a recent program, anybody in Greece knows that these systems are intended to deter Turkey, Greece's NATO ally and historic rival. And some Greeks, not me, would say it's permanent enemy. Not me, by the way, just to make that clear. But Spain apparently has buckled. They've agreed to provide some Patriot missile interceptors, though as I understand it, they're not prepared to part with the actual launchers. It's all very confusing, and I'm not sure I can make much sense of it. But anyway, that's apparently what's going to happen. Spain needs its launchers, but it's prepared to give up its interceptors, even though production of interceptors, Patriot missile interceptors, is very fragile. Only runs to something like 550 units a year. Anyway, they're being sent to Ukraine to restock the Patriot missile launchers that have run out of interceptors. We don't know how many interceptors Spain is giving up. I'm guessing not that many. The British came up with their package a few days ago. Rishi Sunak spoke about it. It was very vague. It didn't look particularly impressive either. Rishi Sunak talking about a massive increase in defence spending, increasing defence spending in Britain to 2.5% of GDP. Charles Moore at the Daily Telegraph let the cat slip out of the bag when he admitted in an article which gave rapturous support to Rishi Sunak's package that this 2.5 billion target by 2030 had already been announced by Boris Johnson when he was Prime Minister 2 years ago. So, in effect, Rishi Sunak is just repackaging commitments which have already been made, re-announcing the same already existing commitments. So, very typical, by the way, of the way in which the British government behaves. Anyway, none of this looks particularly convincing. An arms package from the United States, as I said, which is starting to look less impressive than it first appeared, and the Europeans unable to provide the extra weapons that they're being placed under relentless pressure to do. Now, President Pavel's great plan to buy 800,000 shells on the international arms market appears to be in a state of collapse. The Czechs are apparently admitting that they've only been able to locate securely 300,000 shells. They've only managed to negotiate contracts for 180,000 of these shells. Of course, we have no idea what condition those shells are in, just saying. And on top of that, the Czechs are now complaining that the price of shells is rising and that the $1,500 billion, the $1.5 billion that the European Union, $1.5 billion that the European Union had allocated to buy these shells is not going to be enough. Well, if you were listening to my programs when President Pavel first floated his idea of buying shells on the international arms market, you would not be surprised. You would not be surprised that it turns out that there are fewer shells than he'd been led to believe, and that you would not be surprised either that the arms dealers and Key and the Czech government are presumably in contact with are now increasing the price of their shells. And it turns out that the price of shells is indeed rising in the United States as well. Now, I believe it is true that Ukraine has been receiving more shells from the West than it has acknowledged, than the Western reports have been admitting. But I'm going to make a guess that most of those shells have been coming from the United States. That much of that $24 billion package that the military-industrial complex in the United States is getting, at least a part of it, not a big part of it, but a part of it, is to cover for the supply of 155mm shells to Ukraine. And some of that will be drawn, will have been shells that the United States has forward positioned in all sorts of places, Saudi Arabia, probably Pakistan, places like that. but that those shells have been supplied by the United States, not by the European Union, from President Pavel's shell buying plan. So all of this looking extremely threadbare at the moment. Now compare that with the latest statement by the German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius. He says that the Russians are now producing far more weapons than they need in order to conduct the war. He says that the Russians have far more shells, producing more shells, more tanks, more machines, more missiles. This is, of course, the country whose industrial system supposedly was going to collapse after the sanctions were imposed. Well, people who have been watching these programs will probably find that unsurprising, but the important thing to understand is that it is starting to look as if this American appropriations plan is not going to change the situation on the Ukrainian battlefields significantly. Air defense remains a crisis point. There are now claims, which I take very skeptically, that the F-16s are only going to start operating at the end of 2024 and perhaps 2025, because the Ukrainian pilots who have been trained to fly them are well behind in their training. That may be true, but I'm skeptical about that claim. And like many people, I think it's likely that before long, contractors will be flying them instead. Though heavens knows who would be prepared to take the risk of flying F-16s against the Russians. The price these contractors are going to charge is going to be enormous, and one wonders why they would do that anyway, given that this, frankly, looks like something of a suicide mission. Just saying. But anyway, the point is that the Ukrainians are going to still find themselves in that perennial situation when they're being provided with weapons, but the numbers are never sufficient. It's a case of stop, go. They get small surges of weapons which ease the situation from time to time, but then weapon supplies stop. They then resume again, but in a more chaotic and disorganized way. And air defense essentially has collapsed. Now, there have been pictures of the movements of Russian missiles across Ukraine over the course of the latest Russian missile strike. Many of these missiles appear to have flown over Kiev. That was presumably done on purpose. The point is that it looks as if the air defense system in Kiev made no attempt to intercept these missiles, either because it barely exists or because the Ukrainians feel that they have to husband their missiles. So, a very unsatisfactory situation, and a very unsatisfactory situation in terms of manpower. Now, lots of talk again about Ukraine's mobilization drive. I've already explained how this appears to be filling up Ukrainian military units with men who don't want to fight, with the consequences that we've seen with the collapse of the 115th Brigade in Ocheretino and perhaps now near Berdychi. But it's also looking increasingly likely that Ukraine is not going to be able to assemble anywhere close to the number of men it needs to make up the numbers in its army. Now compare that with the state of the Russian military. Hundreds of thousands of men joining the army every year, and an uninterrupted flow of weapons and supplies. And I'm reading every day, by the way, of new technological developments, especially in drone warfare. The latest, by the way, is to create hunter-killer drones, which will apparently operate above the Russian forces and whose purpose it will be to shoot down Ukrainian FPV drones. I'm not going to try and understand how that's going to work. That's well beyond me. The character of war is changing all the time. And by the way, I get the sense also that Western militaries are well behind in understanding the significance of some of these technological developments as well. But anyway, one could see how lopsided this war is becoming. And to repeat again, the Russians have gained major victories over the last few weeks since the fall of Avdiivka. But I get the sense that they have been doing this whilst exerting, so far, relatively little effort. The Russian forces are now so powerful and so numerous, and the Ukrainian forces are so weak, that relatively little pressure can produce dramatic results. To give one example, I understand that in the Battle of Novomikhailivka, which took place and which the Russians captured a short time ago, apparently only one brigade of the Russian army was operational and was active. Apparently it was a Marine brigade, and the Ukrainians didn't have the forces to withstand it. I'm not sure that this crisis in the Ukrainian military, this collapse of the front lines that people have been warning about, that it might happen in the summer, has been averted at all by these Western arms packages. In fact, I wonder, and this is just a guess now, but or rather a feeling, I wonder whether what we are seeing in places like Ocheretino and Krasnogorovka might be the first signs that that collapse is underway. Anyway, let's move on. Some quick pieces of news. Putin has confirmed that he's traveling to China in May. In the meantime, his defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, has had a meeting with Iran's defense minister, which I think is an important development, and one would be very interested to know what the two men were discussing with each other. Xi Jinping is traveling to Europe, and this has been now confirmed, and importantly, it is confirmed that he is also traveling to Serbia, and specifically to Belgrade. But the reason for his journey to Serbia is a very significant one. Apparently, he's going to attend commemorations that are going to take place near the building of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, which was struck by a missile during the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999. That attack provoked outrage in China, as I very well remember, but it's an event that Western governments have wanted to forget. It seems that Xi Jinping intends instead to commemorate it in the most public way with his own presence. One wonders why Xi Jinping would want to do this at this particular time. Well, it is, of course, the 25th anniversary of that attack on the Chinese embassy, but I can't help but feel that it is connected with the gathering collapse of the relationship between China and the United States, which we are now seeing. And it's, in other words, an attempt by the Chinese government, by Xi Jinping himself, to remind the Chinese people that hostility towards China from the United States is far from a new thing, that even during the period of time when relations between these two superpowers appeared to be relatively good, there was always an undercurrent of hostility and tension. Now, I say that I ought to make it clear that in China at least, it is universally assumed that the attack on the Chinese embassy was intentional. Officially, I understand that the NATO position is still that it was a mistake. I'm not going to judge the matter. All I am going to say is that the Chinese universally believe that it was intended. So that, of course, happening directly after a meeting between Xi Jinping and Secretary of State Tony Blinken, about which more in a moment, and shortly before a further meeting in China between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. So all of this clearly has significance. Now, I discussed yesterday in my program the Chinese readout of the meeting between Xi Jinping and Secretary Blinken. And I said that the Chinese president delivered what looks to have been a very stern lecture to Tony Blinken. And for me, the thread that ran through the Chinese readout, the single thing that the Chinese readout basically highlighted most, was the way in which the Chinese feel that they've been told one thing by the United States, which then proceeds to do the opposite. And Xi Jinping said that if relations are to become stable, actions must be in conformity with words. And he also said that credibility is now an issue. That ought to be a major warning sign for the United States that the relationship between China and the United States is, as I said, on the brink of collapse. When a government completely loses faith in its interactions with another government, then that is when there is a real crisis in relations. That is the stage that we have reached in the relations between the Russians and the West. The Russians have essentially lost all trust in the West, in Western governments, in the US government, in European governments as well. And that is ultimately why we have a crisis in relations between the West and Russia now. And it's looking as if we're coming very close to reaching that very same point in the even more important relations between the United States and China. Anyway, the situation will not have been improved by an astonishing press statement that Secretary Blinken made after his various meetings. He met Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister. He met China's security minister. And of course, he met Xi Jinping. We have not yet been provided by the Chinese with readouts in English for the meetings between Blinken and the two other Chinese officials. But anyway, after the meetings ended, whilst still in China, Secretary Blinken made yet another, I thought, unbelievably ill-conceived and frankly provocative public statement about the situation between the United States and China. Now, there were many of the usual seemingly reassuring words that the United States wants a stable relationship with China, for example, that the United States wants to manage the competition with China, that the United States does not want to restrict the development of China's economy. But then, having said those banalities, because that is what they are, we constantly hear them, Blinken came on to say this: even as we seek to deepen cooperation where our interests align, and this is, again, a fundamental problem, because the United States looks for cooperation, or at least the Biden administration does, when interests align, but is absolutely and incredibly confrontational when it wants to find a pretext for challenges. But anyway, to continue, the United States is very clear-eyed about the challenges posed about China and about our competing visions for the future. So you see, the a la carte approach that the US takes in its relations with China and previously in its relations with Russia, they think that they can pick and choose what to work with the Chinese on and what to work against them on, a position that infuriated the Russians and which infuriates the Chinese. But there's no sign that the Americans are prepared to rethink it. And then, of course, Blinken goes on, America will always defend our core interests and values. Now, the Chinese would not be bothered if the Americans defended their core interests, but values will always ring alarm bells in Beijing, as it did in Moscow, especially as American values tend to be, as the Chinese often point out, a movable feast. So the United States is very worried about human rights in China, very worried about human rights in Russia, where, by the way, the Wall Street Journal now admits that the US intelligence community has acknowledged that Vladimir Putin almost certainly did not order the murder of Alexei Navalny. Very typical of American behavior. An admission like that squirreled away in an article in a broadsheet newspaper. It's not going to prevent people in the United States and in Europe continuing to refer to Navalny as having been murdered by Putin, even though we have this admission hidden away, but nonetheless public, that that was not the case. But anyway, the point is that the United States is always very free to talk about human rights in other places, but of course it's not prepared to address any issue of human rights on its own territory. And of course, if we're talking about the situation in, say, Gaza, well, the United States refuses to accept that there are any parallels or points for discussion at all. Anyway, to continue, in my discussions today, I reiterated our serious concern about China providing components that are powering Russia's brutal war of aggression against Ukraine. China is the top supplier of machine tools, microelectronics, nitrocellulose, which is critical to making munitions and rocket propellants, and other dual-use items that Moscow is using to ramp up its defense industrial base, a defense industrial base that is churning out rockets, drones, tanks, and other weapons that President Putin is using to invade a sovereign country, to demolish its power grid and other civilian infrastructure, to kill innocent children, women, and men. You can take that line about civilian deaths in Ukraine, but Secretary Blinken doesn't use that language about civilian deaths in Gaza. Just saying. Russia would struggle to sustain its assault on Ukraine without China's support. Notice that the claim that the Chinese are providing the Russians with cruise missile engines appears, by the way, to have been dropped. And notice also that the United States, having spent the last 20 plus years calling Russia the gas station masquerading as a country, now admits that it has a defense industrial base churning out rockets, drones, tanks, and other weapons. Just saying. Anyway, apparently it's all possible because the Chinese sell to the Russians machine tools, microelectronics, and nitrocellulose. The latter, by the way, is a particularly ridiculous idea because, of course, the Russians are perfectly capable and almost certainly do produce nitrocellulose on an industrial scale. I understand that the US no longer does, but I am sure that Russia does. And of course, if we're talking about the raw materials to produce nitrocellulose, well, the Russians are able to import that from all kinds of places, including the cotton from Central Asia, former Soviet Central Asia, which is from where I suspect China also imports a great deal of its cotton. Just saying. In my meetings with NATO allies earlier this month, this is going back to Blinken, and with our G7 partners just last week, I heard the same message. Fueling Russia's industrial base not only threatens Ukrainian security, it threatens European security. Beijing cannot achieve better relations with Europe while supporting the greatest threat to European security since the end of the Cold War. So we see Secretary Blinken talking for Europe. European governments apparently can't be trusted to do that. Chancellor Scholz was in Beijing just a few days ago, meeting with Xi Jinping. He doesn't seem to have said anything like that. It falls to Secretary Blinken to do it for him. The extent to which this administration feels that the United States now has ownership over Europe could not be clearer. As we've told China for some time, ensuring transatlantic security is a core US interest. In our discussions today, I made clear that if China does not address this problem, we will. In other words, a clear threat to impose sanctions. And then he goes on to say, I also expressed our concern about China's unfair trade practices and the potential consequences of industrial overcapacity to global and US markets, especially in a number of key industries that will drive the 21st century economy, like solar panels, electric cars, and the batteries that power them. China alone is producing more than 100% of global demand for these products, flooding markets, undermining competition, putting at risk livelihoods and businesses around the world. The Chinese, they have this very big industrial manufacturing economy that they've been building up, well, for the last 50 years or so. And Well, that's not an achievement for the Chinese people. That is a threat to the entire globe, it would seem. But then we get to the key points. He says, now this is a movie that we've seen before, and we know how it ends, with American businesses shuttered and American jobs lost. President Biden will not let this happen on his watch. We'll do what's necessary to ensure that American workers can compete on a level playing field. America's actions are not aimed at holding back China's development, nor are we decoupling our economies. Secretary Yellen said during her recent visit that would be disastrous for the global economy, including for the United States. We want China's economy to grow. So do the American businesses and investors here, several of whom I had an opportunity to speak to in Shanghai. But the way China grows matters. As I told my counterpart, that means fostering a healthy economic relationship where American workers and firms are treated equally and fairly. So sanctions against Chinese banks, because China sells machine tools and microprocessors and nitrocellulose to the Russians, and tariffs against imported Chinese goods, the latter clearly intended to improve President Biden's electoral prospects with blue-collar workers in the United States by telling them that the president is protecting their livelihoods from unfair Chinese competition. This is also, amongst much else, an election speech. And then we go on to read, in today's meetings, this is again from Blinken, I discussed China's dangerous actions in the South China Sea, including against routine Philippine maintenance operations and maritime operations near the Second Thomas Shoal. Freedom of navigation and commerce in these waterways is not only critical for the Philippines, but critical to the US and to every other nation in the Indo-Pacific and indeed around the world. So, if you're in Bolivia or Madagascar, you need to be concerned about what is going on in the Second Thomas Shoal. Just saying. That's why so many nations have expressed concerns about China's maritime maneuvers. I made it clear that whilst the United States will continue to work to de-escalate tensions, well, it doesn't look like it's doing that. Our defense commitments to the Philippines remain ironclad. That looks like a threat. So it doesn't look like de-escalating tensions at all. I reaffirmed the US's one China policy and stressed the critical importance of maintaining peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, which of course refers to Taiwan Strait, not to the situation in Taiwan itself, where $1 billion appropriation for military support for Taiwan has just been voted in Congress. And then we have further comments about Hong Kong and regions in Western China, also incredibly provocative for the Chinese. Anyway, suffice to say, this is one of the most belligerent and confrontational speeches I have ever seen a US Secretary of State make whilst in Beijing. A clear threat of sanctions, and of course we've already been told that sanctions are being prepared against Chinese banks, supposedly intended to decouple them or to detach them from the global financial system, and a clear indicator that tariffs against protective tariffs against Chinese goods are coming, and that this will be part of the president's electoral pitch in the forthcoming presidential election. The Chinese must be absolutely infuriated by this sort of speech. I don't know what it is exactly that this administration thinks it's doing, but it seems to me that one way or the other, it is collapsing relations between China and the United States at a military, strategic, and political level, but also at an economic one, notwithstanding that the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, as Blinken straightforwardly admits, has said that decoupling China from the United States would be disastrous for the global economy, including for the United States. But there we are. That's where we're heading. I know there are some people who still think that this is a bluff from the Americans. If it is, then of course the Chinese are going to call it. But if it is not a bluff, and the Americans intend to follow through with all of this, then it's not a bluff, but a disaster. Even if the United States does not follow through with some of these actions, or if it does take steps like impose light sanctions against Chinese banks, which are not really going to affect their operations in any meaningful way, a huge amount of damage has been done. And we come back to that issue of credibility that the Chinese are complaining about, and the fact that the Chinese have now been given every reason to think that the United States is a hostile country. No wonder Xi Jinping is visiting the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, which was bombed by the Americans 25 years ago. Well, this is where I end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop and get yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things, and the new line that we are preparing to commemorate the events of the 9th of May. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.